He really was an impossible person. Too shy altogether, with absolutely nothing to say for himself, and such a weight. Once he was in your studio, he never knew when to go, but he would sit on and on until you nearly screamed, and burned to throw something enormous after him when he did finally blush his way out. Something like the tortoise stove. The strange thing was, at first sight he looked almost interesting. Everybody agreed about that. You would drift into him in a cafe one evening, and there you would see, sitting in the corner, with a glass of coffee in front of him, a thin, dark boy wearing a blue jersey with a grey flannel jacket buttoned up over it. And somehow, that blue jersey and that grey jacket with the sleeves were too short and gave him an air of a boy who had made up his mind to run away to sea. Who has run away, in fact, and will get up in a moment and sling a knotted handkerchief containing his nightshirt and his mother's picture in the end of a stick, and walk out into the night to be drowned. Stumbled over the wharf edge on his way to the ship even. He had black, close-cropped hair, grey eyes with long lashes, white cheeks and a mouth pouting as though he were determined not to cry. How could one resist him? Oh, one's heart was wrung at sight. And, as if that were not enough, there was his trick of blushing. Whenever the waiter came near him, he turned crimson. He might have been just out of prison, and the waiter in the know. Who is he, my dear? Do you know? Yes, his name is Ian French, painter, awfully clever, they say. Someone started by giving him a mother's tender care. She asked him how often he had heard from home, whether he had enough blankets on his bed, how much milk that he drank a day. But when she went round to his studio to give an eye to his socks, she rang and rang, and though she could have sworn she heard someone breathing inside, the door was not answered. Hopeless. Someone else decided that they ought to fall in love. She summoned him by her side, called him boy, leaned over him so that he might smell the enchanting perfume of her hair, told him how marvellous life could be if one only had the courage, and went round to his studio one evening and rang and rang. Hopeless. What the boy really wants is thoroughly rousing, said a third. So off they went to cafes, cabarets, little dances, places where you drank something that tasted like tinned apricot juice, because 27 shillings a bottle, and was called champagne. Other places, too thrilling for words, where you sat in the most awful gloom, and where someone had always been shot the night before. But he did not turn a hair. Only once he got very drunk, but instead of blossoming forth, he sat there stony, with 2 spots of red on his cheeks, like my dear, yes, the dead image of that ragtime thing they were playing, like a broken doll. But when she took him back to his studio, he had quite recovered, and said good night to her in the street below, as though they had walked home from church together. Hopeless. After heaven knows how many more attempts, for the spirit of kindness dies very hard in women, they gave him up. Of course they were still perfectly charming, and asked him to their shows, and spoke to him in the cafe, but that was all. When one is an artist, one simply has no time for other people who don't respond, has one? And besides, I really think there must have been something rather fishy somewhere, don't you? But it can't all be as innocent as it looks. Why come to Paris if you don't want to be a daisy in a field? No, I'm not suspicious, but... He lived at the top of a tall mournful building overlooking the river, one of those buildings that look so romantic on rainy nights and moonlit nights when the shutters are shut, and the heavy door and the sign advertising a little apartment to let immediately gleams forlorn beyond words. One of those buildings that smells so unromantic all year round, and where the concierge lives in a glass cage on the ground floor, wrapped up in a filthy shawl, stirring something in a saucepan and ladling out tit-bits to the swollen old dog lolling on a bed cushion. Perched up in the air, the studio had a wonderful view. The 2 big windows faced the water. He could see the boats and the barges swinging up and down, and the fringe of an island planted with trees like a round bouquet. The side window looked across to the other house, shabbier still and smaller, and down below there was a flower market. You could see the tops of huge umbrellas, with frills of bright flowers escaping from them, booths covered with striped awning, where they sold plants in boxes and clumps of wet, gleaming palms in terracotta jars. Among the flowers the old women scuttled side to side like crabs. Really there was no need for him to go out. If he had sat at that window until his white beard fell over the sill, he still would have found something to draw. How surprised those tender women would have been if they had managed to force the door, for he kept his studio as neat as a pin, Everything was arranged to form a pattern, a little still life as it were. The saucepans with their lids on the wall behind the gas stove, the bowl of eggs, milk jug and a teapot on the shelf, the books and the lamp with the crinkly paper shade on the table, an Indian curtain that had a fringe of red leopards marching around it covered his bed by day, and on the wall beside the bed, on a level with your eyes when you were lying down, there was a small, perfectly printed notice. Get up at once! Every day was much the same. While the light was good, he slaved at his painting, then cooked his meals and tidied up the place. And in the evenings he went off to the cafe, or sat at home reading, or making out the most complicated list of expenses headed, "What I ought to be able to do it on," and ending with a sworn statement, "I swear not to exceed this amount for the next month, signed Ian French." Nothing very fishy about this, but those far-seeing women were never quite right. One evening he was sitting by the side window eating some prunes and throwing the stones on top of the huge umbrellas in the deserted flower market. It had been raining. The first real spring rain of the year had fallen. A bright spangle hung on everything, and the air smelled like buds and moist earth. Many voices sounding languid and content rang out in the dusky air, and the people who had come close to their windows had fastened the shutters and leaned out instead. Down below in the market the trees were peppered with new green. What kind of trees were they, he wondered. And now came the lamplighter. He stared at the house across the way, the small, shabby house, and suddenly, as if in answer to his gaze, 2 wings of windows opened and a girl came out onto the tiny balcony carrying a pot of daffodils. She was a strangely thin girl in a dark pinafore, with a pink handkerchief tied over her hair. Her sleeves were rolled up almost round her shoulders, and her slender arms shone against the dark stuff. "Yes, it is quite warm enough. It'll do them good," she said, putting down the pot and turning to someone in the room inside. As she turned, she put her hands up to the handkerchief and tucked away some wisps of hair. She looked down at the deserted market and up to the sky, but where he sat might have been a hollow in the air. She simply did not see the house opposite, and then she disappeared. His heart fell out of the side window of his studio and down to the balcony of the house opposite, buried itself in the pot of daffodils under the half-open buds and the spears of green. That room with the balcony was the sitting room, and the one next to it was the kitchen. He heard her clatter of the dishes, and she was washing up after supper, and then she came to the window, knocked a little mop against the ledge, and hung it on a nail to dry. She never sang or unbraided her hair, or held out her arms to the moon as young girls were supposed to do, and she always wore a dark pinafore with a pink handkerchief over her hair. Whom did she live with? Nobody else came to those 2 windows, and yet she was always talking to someone in the room. Her mother, he decided, wasn't able to. They took in sewing. The father was dead. He had been a journalist, very pale, with a long moustache, and a piece of black hair falling over his forehead. By working all day, they made just enough money to live on, but they never went out, and they had no friends. Now, when he sat down at his table, he had to make an entirely new set of sworn statements. Not to go out to the side window before a certain hour, signed Ian French. Not to think about her until he had put away his painting things for the day, signed Ian French. It was quite simple. She was the only person he really wanted to know, because she was, he decided, the only other person alive who was just his age. He couldn't stand giggling girls, and he had no use for grown-up women. She was his age. She was, well, just like him. He sat in his dusky studio, tired, with one arm hanging over the back of his chair, staring in at her window and seeing himself in there with her. She had a violent temper. They quarrelled terribly at times, he and she. She had a way of stamping her foot round and twisting her hands in her pinafore, furious. She very rarely laughed. Only when she told him about an obscure little kitten that she had once who used to roar and pretend to be a lion when she gave it some meat to eat. Things like that made her laugh. But as a rule they sat together very quietly, he, just as he was sitting now, and she with her hands folded on her lap and her feet tucked under, talking in low tones, or silent and tired after a day's work. Of course she never asked him about his pictures, and of course he made the most wonderful drawings of her which she hated, because he made her so thin and so dark. But how could he get to know her? This might go on for years. Then he discovered that once a week in the evening she went out shopping. On 2 successive Thursdays she came to the window wearing an old-fashioned cape over the pinafore and carrying a basket. From where he sat he could not see the door of her house. But on the next Thursday evening, at which time came, he snatched up his cap and ran down the stairs. There was a lovely pink light over everything. He saw it glowing in the river, and the people walking towards him had pink faces and pink hands. He leaned against the side of the house waiting for her, and he had no idea of what he was going to do or say. "Here she comes," said a voice in his head. She walked very quickly with small light steps. With one hand she carried the basket, and with the other she kept the cape together. What could he do? He could only follow. First she went to the grocer's and spent a long time there, and then she went into the butcher's where she waited for her turn, and then she was an age at the draper's matching something, and then she went to the fruit shop and bought a lemon. As he watched her he knew more surely than ever that he must get to know her. Her composure, her seriousness and her loneliness, the very way she walked as though she was eager to be done with the world full of grown-ups, was so natural to him and so inevitable. Yes, she's always like that, he thought proudly. We have nothing to do with these people. But now she was on her way home and he was as far off as ever. She suddenly turned into the dairy and he saw her through the window buying an egg. She picked it out of the basket with such care, a brown one, a beautifully shaped one, the one he would have chosen. And when she came out of the dairy he went right after her. In a moment he was out again, and following her past his house across the flower market, dodging among the huge umbrellas and treading on the fallen flowers and the round marks where the pots had stood. Through her door he crept, and up the stairs after, taking care to tread with her in time so that she would not notice. Finally, she stopped on the landing and took a key out of her purse. As she put it into the door he ran up and faced her. Blushing more crimson than ever, but looking at her severely, he said, almost angrily, "Excuse me, mademoiselle, you dropped this." He handed her an egg.